My wife toasted her lover at the couple's dinner and said, "To our love," so I walked over to them, firmly, as if closing a chapter. I looked her in the eyes and simply said, "I hope the toast was worth the ending." I left without raising my voice, but with a resolute heart. Later, she discovered that her lover wanted nothing more than a hidden game and was left with the silence she chose. I, little by little, found a new love with a sincere smile and a gaze that hides nothing. When she sought me out, full of regret, I listened calmly. I forgave. Not to get back together, but to move on with ease. She was left with the memory of what she lost, with the peace of someone who was faithful to the end. What no one saw was what came before, what came during, what remained after. No one knew the sound my chest made when I heard those words, spoken like a cup of poison delivered with a smile. To our love. I said it without blinking, without blushing, as if the love she celebrated wasn't the same one that promised to keep me. As if I wasn't there. As if I'd never existed. And all I could do was hold her gaze, hide the pain, stand with the dignity she'd given up along with the ring. I didn't scream. I didn't cause a scene. I just took a deep breath, pointed my heart at the door, and walked. Did it hurt? A lot. Each step seemed to tear away pieces of my soul she would never understand. But I walked. And in that instant, I knew, what ended there was never just my love. It was the end of an illusion shared by one. Me. What stings most in a betrayal isn't the stolen kiss, the hidden touch, the bed shared with another body. It's the averted gaze, the gentle lie, the absent presence. It's realizing, with the clarity of someone who sees everything in slow motion, that love became routine and routine became an excuse. That the other person gradually disappeared, and we, out of fear, began to accept the silences as if they were normal. She started smiling less at home, and smiling too much at messages I never read. She started leaving before me, coming back later, avoiding long conversations. She started forgetting dates she'd previously celebrated in detail. She started avoiding me on the couch. In the bedroom. In my eyes. And me? I noticed. But I kept quiet. Because loving too much, sometimes, is staying quiet so as not to lose. And, ironically, the silence made me lose anyway. There was a day, not long before dinner, when she came home smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers. And when I questioned her, she laughed and said it was from her friend from work. I wanted to believe her. But my stomach knew. There was another time when she left her unlocked phone in the car, and a notification popped up with a nickname I'd never heard. I didn't open it. Because deep down, when we love, we prefer to suffer from doubt than to acknowledge the pain. Betrayal, most of the time, doesn't begin in bed. It begins when the other person stops considering you. When attention becomes favor. When affection becomes a forced routine. When their eyes, once entirely focused on you, start searching for something else. And the cruelest part of all is realizing that you still love someone when you've already been dumped. At dinner, I already knew. Most of me had already accepted it. But hearing that phrase from her lips, "To our love," toasting it, her glass raised as if celebrating a victory over my blindness, was more than I could bear. She wasn't just betraying me. She was mocking what we were. And he, the lover, laughed. He laughed as if I were a secondary character in his own story. As if my place at that table was to be a spectator to the downfall. They didn't know it, but there, in that moment, I lost love, and gained back what she took from me, myself. What came next, she didn't expect. Because most cheaters believe the other will beg, cry, implode. But I didn't beg. I just walked away. She stayed, cup in hand, victory empty. And me? I was rebuilt in pain. Alone. Piece by piece. I remembered who I was before molding myself to her will. I listened to my music again. I walked aimlessly again. I cooked for myself again. I cared for my silence. And it was in this silence that the unexpected happened. I discovered a new smile. A gaze that didn't shy away. A companion who listened with presence. Someone who didn't need to promise me eternal love, because they offered me respect in the now. It wasn't immediate. It was slow, beautiful, and honest. And I, hurt, learned to trust again. Meanwhile, she stumbled over her own mistakes. Her lover, as expected, grew tired of the game. He left her without explanation. And she finally faced the void she'd created. She tried to return. She tried to win him back. She tried to say she was confused, needy, lost. But the apologies didn't embrace her like they used to. She didn't want me. She wanted what I represented. Stability. Secure love. The certainty that she would be loved even if she failed. But I wasn't the same anymore. I had too many scars to remake myself in the same mold. I forgave, yes. Because holding a grudge is like carrying a house that's no longer mine. But I didn't get back together. Because we don't go back to where we were destroyed. Years later, she found a diary again. An old notebook where I'd written everything. There were our first dates, our plans, our favorite phrases. But there were also the pains I'd kept quiet. The day I suspected and said nothing. The day I saw her laughing on her cell phone and pretended not to notice. The day I cried alone in the bathroom while she slept. Every word was a mirror of my pain. And when she read it, she fell apart. She realized she'd betrayed someone who loved her deeply. With presence. With care. She realized she'd traded the most honest love of her life for a moment of vanity. And that was the worst punishment, knowing no one would write about her like that again. That no one would ever see her with the purity I once had. She didn't just lose her husband. She lost the last pure look she would ever receive. She lost the sincere laughter that was hers alone. She lost the home we built together. She lost the right to return. And I, finally, gained what she never understood, peace. Self-love. Freedom. And most importantly, someone who wouldn't raise a glass to another love in front of me. But, what happened that night after the toast? What did she do when she realized I wasn't coming back? What was left of our home, our friends, our past? And what happened when, years later, she found the courage to look for me again? Not all loves end at once. Some die slowly, until one day, someone decides to walk out the door, and never come back. Welcome to the channel. Here, no type of betrayal is romanticized or justified. The stories you will hear are fiction, but they reflect painful truths. Betrayal destroys homes, hearts and trust. Each narrative is a warning, not about what love should be, but about what it should never become. Get ready. What you're about to hear is shocking, realistic and unforgettable. Let the story begin. They met in a small corner cafe, when the wind still carried dry leaves from late autumn, and they both seemed to carry the same barely healed scars from their youth. He, with his serene eyes and restrained smile, carried a calm that seemed to have been built in silence, after many losses and disappointments. She, intense, talkative, with a curious sparkle in her eyes, seemed the perfect opposite. The kind of woman who spoke with her hands, laughed with her whole body, and who, even in pauses, lightened the atmosphere. There was no rush. It was weeks of casual encounters, conversations too long to be mere coincidence, until they both understood there was something there, something that didn't scream, but took root almost invisibly. When they decided to name their feelings, they made no grandiose promises, just a simple and powerful agreement, not to lie to each other. Their relationship was built like a house made with their own hands. Every gesture, every choice, every word spoken was a carefully placed brick. In the first few months, it felt like a breath of fresh air, as if they'd finally found a place where they could rest, exist without armor. He was the kind of man who remembered the way she liked her coffee, the silence she needed before bed, the songs that made her cry in the car for no reason. She, on the other hand, was present in everything, in the notes left on the table, the spontaneous compliments, the almost involuntary touches in the middle of the street, as if to say, I'm here. They lived their daily lives with unpretentious harmony, without the need for grand declarations. They weren't the couple of social media, of forced smiles for photos, but of lazy Sundays, of dinners together after work, of knowing glances amidst the noise of life. The outside world always seemed a little less aggressive when they were together. They married after 2 years. The ceremony was intimate, with few guests and plenty of affection. The vows were spoken with the simplicity that defined them both, no rehearsed phrases, just the raw truth of someone who knew life would have difficult days, but who believed in the daily choice to stay. Their new home was built with sacrifice and dedication. The walls still smelled of fresh paint when they put the first pictures together, and her laughter echoed as he tried to understand the furniture instructions. There was something magical in the way they adapted to each other's flaws, transforming each mistake into an inside joke, each flaw into a memory. It wasn't an idealized love, it was real, with tiredness, irritating quirks, disagreements over small things, but always permeated by a respect that seemed unbreakable. She began to grow professionally, something he always enthusiastically supported. He remembered the first day she arrived home, ecstatic about being promoted. He opened a bottle of wine and made her dance in the kitchen, even though he didn't quite know the steps. He was happy to see her happy, and she knew it. There was this certainty of support between them, this safe space neither of them had known in other relationships. Her achievements felt like his too. And even when her schedules became more demanding, when she began traveling more, taking phone calls in the middle of the night, he never questioned her commitment. He trusted her. Truly. Because, over the years, she had been everything he needed, transparent, consistent, loyal. He, in turn, led a more peaceful life. He worked more steadily, with set hours, which allowed him to take care of the house, prepare dinner, and wait for her with a little surprise from time to time. He was the kind of person who shopped for her favorite foods, the kind who put her clothes in the wash without her asking, the kind who learned the recipe for her favorite dish so he could make it on a regular day. This wasn't a demand, it was care. And she, even when tired, smiled and responded, even with a touch on the shoulder, a kiss on the forehead, or a uttered phrase in the middle of the night, "Thank you for being my home." It was that kind of love, the kind that didn't need to be said out loud every day, but which showed itself in continuous and delicate actions. Life fell into place like a jigsaw puzzle. Mutual friends, dinners with other couples, weekend trips, anniversaries celebrated intimately. They had little rituals, watching old movies on Fridays, walking in the park on Sundays, writing notes hidden in pockets or diaries. Sometimes they fought, sure, but they knew how to apologize. They knew how to listen. There was a quiet maturity in the way they handled conflict. And because of that, those around them used to say they were the kind of couple that gave hope. The kind that made us believe that true love still existed. The kind of relationship that inspired. But time, with its subtle way of rearranging things, began to change the direction of the wind. She became more involved with work. Meetings after hours, weekend appointments, important dinners with colleagues and clients. He understood. He'd never been the kind of man who needed constant presence to feel loved. He trusted her because he believed that, even physically distant, she maintained the bond. And at first, she made a point of reinforcing this. She'd text him in the middle of the day, call him before bed when she was traveling, ask him how his routine was. But gradually, these gestures diminished. They didn't disappear completely, but they lost their intensity. Her responses became shorter, her glances more vacant. Sometimes she seemed too distracted, like someone with a fixed thought elsewhere. He noticed, but thought it was just stress, fatigue, exhaustion. And it was at this point that love began to be tested. Because when one begins to withdraw emotionally, the other feels it. Even if you can't name it. Even if you try to compensate. He started preparing more elaborate dinners, asking her more often how she was, creating situations that would reconnect them. And she smiled, thanked him, said everything was fine. That it was just a phase. That it would soon pass. But the truth is, she was no longer fully there. There was a different weariness in her eyes. A smile that was forced. A touch that seemed more polite than intimate. And he, out of love, chose not to see clearly. He chose to believe her version. He chose to keep alive what seemed to be slowly dying. There were nights when she would lie down and turn on her side without saying a word. And he, on the other side of the bed, would reach out to touch her back, but he would stop halfway. Out of respect. Out of fear of invading a space that had suddenly ceased to be his. Still, he continued to love. Still, he made plans. He thought about children. About future trips. About renewing their vows on their anniversary. He carried the relationship on his shoulders with a silent hope. And perhaps that was the mistake, loving too much when the other was no longer willing to try. But those who truly love don't see the signs as giving up, they see it as a phase, a temporary difficulty, an obstacle to be overcome together. And that's how he carried on, fighting alone for a love that, little by little, was fading away. Despite this, she still showed affection at times. Some nights, after a long time, she would rest her head on his shoulder and say she was tired, that she needed a hug. And he, as always, offered everything without hesitation. He didn't demand, he didn't judge. He simply welcomed her. He believed that this separation was part of life, that everything would work out with patience. He continued writing little notes, making coffee, trying to be a constant support. And she continued to receive it, sometimes gratefully, sometimes hurriedly. But never clearly saying that anything had changed. And he, believing in the love they had built, didn't ask. Perhaps out of fear of the answer. Perhaps because he thought love was enough. Perhaps because he didn't understand that sometimes, even the most sincere love may not be enough to keep someone close. Nothing seemed drastically wrong. But then again, nothing seemed absolutely right. They were still a couple, but they no longer walked at the same pace. He held on, trying to rekindle a fire that, from her side, seemed to have already turned to ash. And yet, he believed. Because when you love deeply, you persist. You wait. You fight as long as your body can bear, as long as your heart can bear. And he endured. A lot. He endured in silence, with dignity. Loving with the hope that everything would fall into place. Unaware that sometimes love ends not with a bang, but with the silence of someone who has stopped trying. And it was precisely in this silence that history began to fall apart. Not all at once, but like invisible cracks slowly spreading through the structures. Cracks he couldn't see, but which one day, inevitably, would bring everything crashing down. He began to notice the changes, like someone noticing a colder house but still closing the windows to keep the heat in. Her scent became different, still familiar, but more distant, sweeter, more pronounced than it used to be. The music in the car was different, the playlist was no longer theirs, and he noticed it without knowing how to react. The laughter on the phone came more and more frequently, but no longer with him. At night, when they lay down, she took a long time to fall asleep, and it wasn't insomnia, it was restlessness. Her cell phone, previously left on the nightstand, now slept under her pillow or went with her to the bathroom. He didn't ask questions. He had learned, over time, that certain questions don't bring answers, they only confirm fears. And yet, he tried to maintain a routine. He cooked dinners, tended the garden she claimed to love, organized short weekend getaways in quiet, unhurried places. But she always had a last-minute commitment. A Saturday meeting, brunch with a friend, an event she couldn't refuse. He tried not to take it personally, telling himself it was just a phase, that work took too much out of her. And when she said, "Sorry, I'm exhausted," he smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "It's okay, I understand." But he didn't understand. He simply loved her too much to admit he was losing himself in her. There was one Saturday in particular when he prepared a candle at dinner, for no reason, just to relive something they seemed to have lost. He lit the candles, played the soft music she used to hum in the kitchen, opened an antique wine he'd kept since their honeymoon. He waited for hours. She arrived after 10 o'clock, looking tired, saying they needed to reschedule. He just smiled, blew out the candles, put away the wine, and said, "Of course, love." That night, he didn't sleep. And for the first time, he felt angry. Not at her. At himself, for continuing to offer so much to someone who no longer seemed interested in receiving. But even so, in the morning, he made coffee, left a loving note, and went to the market to buy her favorite fruit. It was the way he knew how to love, by persisting. Her emotional distance was already evident. She was present, yet absent. They talked less, laughed less, touched less. Everything seemed mechanical. When he told her he loved her, she responded with a brief smile or a "me too" that sounded more like obligation than feeling. Still, he didn't back down. He continued to believe things would go back to the way they were, that she just needed time, rest, space. And so, he didn't question her increasingly frequent outings. Or the last-minute dinners. Or the friends he'd never met. Until the day he found, among her papers, a restaurant card, a restaurant she swore she didn't know, but which now bore her name on a reservation for two. He held the card for minutes, his eyes fixed as if trying to make it disappear. But it didn't disappear. Still, he didn't confront her. He put the card away, swallowed hard, and went to work. The following weeks brought more absences. She began arriving later and later, with less elaborate excuses. The smile she wore when she entered the house was gone. She was in a hurry to shower, to sleep, to leave again. She began to care less about dinners, notes, details. And he, like someone in silent mourning, began to adapt to this. He stopped preparing surprises, waiting for long answers, insisting on conversations. He began to talk less. And this, paradoxically, made her more comfortable. As if, in the absence of questioning, she could live her other truths without guilt. He became the silent home, while she explored side streets. One day, as they walked through a grocery store together, something they hadn't done in months, she answered the phone and stepped away to talk. He watched from afar. Her laugh was different. Looser. Lighter. She turned her back to him as she spoke, walked to an empty aisle, and there, for a few minutes, forgot he existed. When she returned, she disguised herself. She said she was a friend. He merely nodded. But then, something inside him cracked. Like glass that doesn't shatter all at once, but will never be whole again. He began to observe her with a different gaze. He no longer sought confirmation of love. He searched for traces of truth. And that hurt. Because her every gesture now seemed charged with distance. It was that same week that she announced they were having a couple's dinner the following Saturday with friends from work. He didn't want to go. But he went. For her. To try one more time. Because he thought that perhaps, among others, he could recapture what they were missing. He dressed carefully. He chose the shirt she said she liked. He sprayed on the perfume she used to steal. When she emerged from the room ready, he looked at her as if begging to be seen. But she only adjusted her earrings and said, "Shall we go?" On the way, she said little. At the restaurant, she introduced him to her colleagues formally, as if introducing a life partner, not a soul mate. He sensed it. But he pretended not to. As he had been doing for months. Dinner took place in an elegant setting, with low lighting and ambient music. She was different. More animated. Smiled more. But not with him. With the others. Especially with one man at the table. A new colleague, she said. Tall, with a confident gaze, well-measured gestures. They both laughed frequently. They exchanged references he didn't know. They exchanged glances. They exchanged presences. And he, sitting next to her, was just an audience. The food lost its flavor. The wine burned in her throat. She spoke with a sparkle in her eyes, and it wasn't meant for him. And then, in the middle of the conversation, the toast. She raised her glass, looked at the man, and said, without fear, without hesitation, without embarrassment, with a slight smile, "To our love." The table fell silent for a second. Perhaps the others didn't understand what that meant. But he knew. He felt. He understood everything. He stood up. He didn't make a scene. He simply stood, straightened his shirt, and looked at her with the firmness of someone who has lost and found themselves at the same time. He approached slowly, with the calm of someone who has accepted a fall. He fixed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she was startled by that look. Without raising his voice, he simply said, "I hope the toast was worth the end." And he left. Without looking back. Without giving her time for explanations, excuses, or empty promises. The restaurant door closed behind him, and with it, the last remaining space for hope. For the first time, she saw him leave. And she understood that something had ended. But I didn't yet know how much I would lose. I didn't yet know what was coming. She couldn't handle the silence. In the early days, she waited for a message, a call, any sign that he was still there, willing to listen, to talk, to hurt a little more just to try to save what was left. But nothing came. His silence wasn't a punishment, it was a decision. And that was what destabilized her most. Because she always believed he would be there, even if hurt, even if disappointed, always ready to forgive, to start over. Only this time, he simply left. He didn't slam the door, he didn't yell, he didn't beg for explanations. He just left. And in doing so, he took with him everything she held most dear. Because, in that moment, she didn't lose a husband. She lost the man who loved her like no one else had ever loved her. In the days that followed, she tried to carry on as if nothing had fallen apart. She spoke to her friends with the same lightheartedness as always, invented excuses for her separation, plastered smiles on her face like someone applying too much makeup to cover a deep wound. Her lover, for his part, seemed even more involved. He sent frequent messages, made plans that, until then, had seemed distant. She immersed herself in the illusion that this could become something solid, real, perhaps even better than what she had before. But it all happened too quickly. In less than 2 weeks, he began to withdraw. He no longer responded as quickly, cancelled dates with vague excuses, and dropped comments here and there that she pretended not to notice. Until one day, he simply disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. No response. Nothing. And for the first time, she felt the weight of what she had done. She was alone. By her own choice. She tried calling him. He didn't answer. She tried going to the apartment. No one answered the door. She sent messages, but they remained blank and ignored. After 3 days of silence, she received an email notification. It was from him. A single paragraph. To the point. Cruel. It said he was getting back together with someone from the past, that he never intended to make their relationship serious, that he had simply let himself get carried away. And it ended with a sentence that echoed inside her like a sentence: "You mistook neediness for love and ended up destroying the only one who truly loved you." She read it over and over, as if each rereading could rewrite the outcome. But nothing changed. And nothing hurt more than knowing it was true. There were days of denial, then weeks of regret. She tried to find strength in her friends, but many already knew. The comment at dinner, the coldness with which she treated her own husband in front of others, the way her lover treated her as more than a colleague, people saw it. And, even if they didn't say anything, they judged. They began to distance themselves. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations became shorter. And she, little by little, felt the ground slipping away. The house, once full of life, now sounded like a constant echo. His clothes were still in the closet, his perfume still lingered on the pillow, his favorite cups in the kitchen. Everything was still there. Except him. She tried to find him. She sent messages that went unanswered. She waited outside his usual workplace. But she didn't see him. Until, a month after dinner, she found a letter under her door. It wasn't a direct reply, but it was signed by him. It said he needed distance, that he still carried too much pain to look at her without breaking, that their love had been real, but now needed a dignified burial. She cried like never before. She screamed inside the house, tore up the letter, then tried to glue it back together, as if that could reverse time. But nothing was enough. Nothing brought him back. Time passed with the slowness of someone who doesn't want to heal. And one night, rummaging through old boxes in the closet, he found a notebook. One of those he always used to jot down random thoughts, story ideas, poems he never shared with anyone. He leafed through it without thinking, simply on impulse. But as the pages turned, the words began to weigh heavily. There were sentences he'd written about her. Sweet, detailed words, from someone who observed every gesture, every habit, every smile. Texts that spoke of how much she was the center of his life, of how he felt with her, of how he dreamed of growing old together. With each page, her chest tightened. Until she reached a date close to dinner. It was a letter. Never delivered. Handwritten, in shaky handwriting. In it, he said he'd found her old diary, a notebook forgotten on one of the shelves. He said he'd spent hours reading it all. The pages spoke of the early days of their courtship, of their discoveries, their dreams, her declarations. He spoke of how she'd written that he was the love of her life, that she could never look at another man. But there, among those memories of love, were also recent pages. Confessions. Thoughts. Doubts. And among them, he read something that destroyed him inside, the exact moment she chose to cheat. Not for lack of love, but for vanity. For the desire to feel desired by another. Because she thought he would never leave, even if she made a mistake. In the letter he wrote and never delivered, he said he read every word with a broken heart, but that he still wanted to fight. He said he had planned a surprise for that very night of dinner to try to rekindle what they were losing. But when he got there, he saw she had already made her choice. And that was what killed him inside. Not the betrayal itself, but knowing she no longer wanted to be chosen by him. That her love was no longer his. That, in front of everyone, she would toast something that should have been buried in secret. That she would do it with a smile. The letter ended with a single sentence: "You were the love of my life, but I wasn't enough to be the love of yours." Upon reading it, she broke down. She fell to the living room floor, hugging the notebook, as if holding a lifeless body. She felt the weight of lost love. Of the story she destroyed with her own hands. Of words that will never be spoken again. Of silences that will now be eternal. And for the first time, she understood it wasn't about forgiveness. It was about loss. She lost the man who truly loved her. She lost the dreams he'd carefully written. She lost the chance to be remembered tenderly. And she understood that the worst punishment isn't being abandoned. It's being forgotten by someone who, one day, never considered leaving. A few months passed after the letter. And with them, the world around him seemed to have taken on other colors for him, even though the tone of his memories remained gray. The wounds no longer bled, but left visible marks on everything he touched. The house where they had lived together was left behind. He moved to a smaller, simpler, quieter apartment. He left behind the furniture they had chosen together, the pillows she had embroidered, the paintings they had bought on their travels, and took only the essentials: clothes, books, utensils, and some papers he still held on to out of affection. He began working remotely on a project of his own, something he had long put off to support her dreams. Now, with time and space empty, he found in solitude a way to reorganize his existence. He no longer waited for messages, nor relived conversations in his mind. He simply walked, one day at a time, rediscovering what it meant to live without waiting for someone. It was in a small bookstore, on a street he never passed, that he met the woman who would change the course of his life. She was sitting in a corner, a stack of books beside her, jotting something down in a notebook. Her eyes glanced up by chance when he tripped over an awkwardly positioned chair. They laughed. He apologized. She replied that she also tended to trip over everything, including feelings. And there, without any pretense, a light, honest, fluid conversation began. They exchanged glances without any urgency to seduce. There was no rush, only curiosity. They began to meet casually, coffees, long walks, book exchanges. She spoke with rare sincerity, and the way she listened enchanted him. She was different. She didn't ask invasive questions, didn't bring up uncomfortable topics. She just let him be. Over time, her smiles became shelter, and the way she looked at him didn't make him feel like he had to prove himself. For the first time, he was loved effortlessly. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, the woman who lost him continued in a silence that seemed to shrink everything around her. The large house became small, stuffy, painful. The crowded rooms now echoed with lonely footsteps. Routine became a burden. His clothes, which once perfumed the drawers, now merely took up space, like a reminder of what would never return. She tried to return to social life, to force normalcy, but it was impossible. The guilt wouldn't let her. She carried his absence like someone dragging invisible chains. Every object in the house was a memory. Each day without news of him was a punishment. She began writing letters she would never send, trying to find solace in words. But nothing was enough. He didn't return. He didn't respond. He didn't seek her out. The pain of being forgotten began to hurt more than the pain of having made a mistake. It was on a rainy late afternoon that she decided to go to the building where she'd learned, through a mutual friend, that he was living. She brought no flowers, no ready-made apologies. Just his tired body and the heavy gaze of someone who no longer knew how to exist without what he'd destroyed. She waited for almost an hour outside, under an awning, watching the windows and trying to guess which one was his. When she finally saw him leaving, time seemed to freeze. He was holding hands with someone. And it wasn't just the presence of another woman that struck her. It was the way he smiled. The lightness in his gaze. The spontaneous touch. The natural intimacy between them. It was the cruel confirmation that he hadn't just moved on, he had found a new love. A serene, mature, whole love. A love that needed no games, no forgiveness. It was another life. One where she no longer had a place. She didn't call him. She didn't make a fuss. She just watched, hidden, until he disappeared around the corner. She walked home with the rain weighing down more than her shoulders could bear. And that night, for the first time, she wrote something different. I don't want him to come back. I want him to stay where he is, happy. But I don't know how to live with that. The weeks that followed were a limbo. But, driven by a desire to try to end it with dignity, she wrote one last letter. With no pretensions of reconciliation. Just a request to be listened to. And she delivered it by hand, days later, when she finally found him alone in a park, reading a book. He saw her approach and didn't stand. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He simply closed the book calmly, as if closing a cycle. She sat down, apologized for the inconvenience. And then she began to speak. Her voice trembled, but it wasn't hysteria. It was pain. She told him about the days following the separation. About the emptiness of the house. About the lover who disappeared. About the letters she never sent. She said she discovered the notebook. That she read it all. That she cried on every page. And then there was silence. He looked at her serenely, but without nostalgia. There was no more anger. But there was no longing either. He thanked her for her words. He said that, for a long time, he had wanted to understand what had happened. And that, by reading her diary, he understood more than he would have liked. And then, for the first time, he said what he had never said before. I didn't leave because of the other guy. I left when I realized you no longer cared about how I felt. The betrayal was just confirmation of what I already knew, that I was alone in that. She tried to hold back her tears, but the tears flowed uncontrollably. She said she never imagined he would leave. That she thought he would love her forever, despite everything. And he replied, his voice low but firm, I loved you beyond what was healthy. And because of that, I needed to save myself. She lowered her eyes. She said she just wanted to know if he forgave her. He was silent for a few seconds and then said, yes. But not to get back together. To move on. She nodded. She closed her eyes. To take a deep breath. She stood up and thanked him. Before leaving, she looked at him one last time and said, you were the best chapter of my life. It's a shame I only understood that in the epilogue. He didn't answer. He simply opened the book again and continued reading. Not as a way of ignoring her, but as a symbol of who he was now, someone who had finally found peace in silence, purpose in pain, and freedom in starting over. She left, her heart crushed by the knowledge of having destroyed what she would never have again. And he, sitting there on that park bench, knew that story had ended. Not with screams, not with promises, but with the acceptance that some losses are final, and that some choices cost forever. After that conversation on the park bench, where no more questions remained and where the absence of shouting or accusation said more than any argument could, everything seemed to lose its meaning for a time. He hadn't just forgiven her, but he'd freed her from the weight of guilt without offering any hope of return. There was no longer an opening, no margin, no crack to infiltrate. The door wasn't just closed, it had been removed, the frames removed, the structure demolished. There was no way back. He listened to her, accepted her repentance, welcomed her words, and yet, he chose to move on. That was the part that hurt the most, realizing that, even though she'd been forgiven, she was still dispensable to him. Because his love, once immense, was now just a carefully organized memory, without hurt, without a desire to relive it. It was a past that no longer hurt, because it no longer mattered. From that moment on, time seemed to divide into what had been before and what had become after. For her, the days passed like replicas of each other, with hours dragged by, filled with prolonged silences and automatic gestures. People continued their lives, and she pretended to continue as well. But inside, the awareness of what she had lost slowly and steadily gnawed at her. The smiles she gave in conversation seemed rehearsed, encounters with old friends were tense and filled with measured phrases. She was no longer seen the same way. There was something in the looks of others, a kind of veiled judgment, a breach of trust that seemed irreversible. The people who had once admired her as a wife, as a centered woman, now seemed to view her with a mixture of pity and distance. And she felt it. She felt like she was no longer part of anything that had once made her feel whole. Meanwhile, he continued with the lightness of someone no longer carrying the burden of trying to fix what was broken. His routine found balance in new habits. He began dedicating more time to personal projects, taking short trips to places he'd always wanted to visit but had put off due to lack of time or a commitment to someone who was no longer there. And with the woman who had entered his life without promises, everything was different. There were no demands, no idealizations, just presence. She loved him as he was in that moment, with the scars and the maturity gained through pain. They walked together, but unhurriedly, respecting the spaces and the wounds still healing. The love that formed there was quieter, more solid. It wasn't born from the desire to fill absences, but from the pleasure of sharing new voids. With her, he rediscovered the ability to laugh at everyday life, to admire small gestures, to listen to music without feeling something was missing. The difference was in her gaze. He was now looked at with admiration and surrender, and no longer with haste or distraction. And then came their wedding anniversary. The date that, for years, symbolized promises, special dinners, notes left on the pillow. She woke early that day, even though she had nothing to celebrate. But her heart pounded as if waiting for something. A sign, a memory, a message. Nothing came. And it was in this emptiness that she decided to do something different. She opened an old box where she kept photographs, letters, mementos of a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. She looked through them one by one, as if trying to piece together a past that, even if it still existed, could no longer be accessed. And at the bottom of that box, she found an envelope he had left months before, with a final message she had never had the courage to read. With trembling hands, she opened it. And there, in a few words, he had written something that destroyed her even more: the longing will pass. But I hope regret teaches you more than love did. It was the last tear of the day, the last reminder of that bond that was now, finally, completely buried. The months went by. And while she deepened her reflections, he continued to rebuild his own life. He even turned down a job opportunity in another country, not out of fear of starting over, but because, for the first time, there was something in the present he didn't want to lose: his current relationship. The woman with him was sober in her feelings, sweet in her words, firm in her decisions. She looked at him as if she recognized a whole person in him, and that made him recognize himself as well. He no longer needed to prove his worth. He no longer sought approval from doubting eyes. Life, now, was quieter, but infinitely more sincere. One night, a chance encounter changed everything again. He was invited to a literary event, where he presented his writings for the first time. She appeared in the audience. She sat quietly in the back, unintentionally, not wanting to be seen, just to listen to him read passages that might one day have been written for her. When he took the stage, he read a text about rebirth. About loving with everything and still losing. About learning to live after loss. He didn't mention names. But the words carried weight. So many people applauded, moved. She, deep down, just wept silently. At the end of the event, she approached, excused herself, and thanked him for listening. He smiled, a light smile, without hurt, and replied that the most painful stories are the ones that teach us the most. She then asked him if he still felt anything. And he answered sincerely, I feel gratitude. Because it was with you that I learned how far I can love. And it was by losing you that I learned how far I should love myself. That night, when she got home, she stared at her own reflection for long minutes. Not as someone seeking answers, but as someone who, for the first time, accepts the consequences of her own actions without trying to justify them. She finally understood that the love she destroyed was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. That the mistakes she made couldn't be fixed with pretty words or belated regrets. And, most of all, she understood that some damage is permanent. That forgiving isn't the same as getting back. And that being forgiven doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes, it only reveals the extent of what was lost. He, in turn, when he closed the door that same night, found the woman with whom he now shared his days sitting at the table, reading a book. She looked at him with that same serene gaze that always welcomed him. He approached, kissed her on the forehead, and sat beside her. They were silent for a few minutes, and then he said, Today I truly closed a cycle. She didn't respond with words. She simply held his hand firmly, as if she understood without needing to ask. And there, in that simplicity, he realized that true love doesn't need promises or grand gestures, it needs only presence, respect, and truth. And that, now, he had. No shadows. No lies. No fear of being left again. While she, the other, continued to live with the weight of regret, with memories that would never again become reality, with words that would never be heard again, he, finally, walked toward the conclusion of his own story. A story where, despite everything, he chose not to be a victim of pain, but the author of his own peace. And even knowing that some wounds leave permanent marks, he now knew, it is possible to love again, even after being broken. But only when you learn that self-love comes before any other. As the months passed, the story that had once been about two people became a solitary road for her and a new horizon for him. She now lived amidst the emotional ruins of everything she had been and everything she would never be again. The days were no longer merely repetitive, they became heavy, because each morning was accompanied by the involuntary reminder that he was no longer there, that the love that once filled her had been too real to be replaced by any distraction. And what tore her apart most was not his physical absence, but the knowledge that he remained alive, whole, remade, without her. It was the kind of pain that doesn't bleed outward, but consumes from within. And she, even surrounded by everything she had once built, found herself completely empty, stumbling over the echo of her own choices, forced to live with the fragments of a happiness she herself had crushed. The nights seemed longer than they should have been. The pillow, now silent, was no longer an accomplice to nocturnal laughter or whispered confessions. Her phone remained silent, without any important notifications, and social media became cruel traps. Seeing him smiling in new places, with new people, living new chapters without carrying traces of the past, was like watching, every day, a movie where she had been cut from the story. She tried, impulsively, to start over in the wrong ways. She tried encounters without feeling, conversations without depth, company without connection. Nothing made sense. Nothing pulled her from the place where she had buried herself. Guilt was a persistent ghost, and regret, a mirror that never stopped showing her what she had been capable of destroying with a single thoughtless choice. He, on the other hand, followed the process of rebuilding with a delicacy that came with maturity. He no longer carried the urgency to prove he was okay. He simply was. He had understood, after so long, that peace doesn't come when the past stops hurting, but when we learn to live with it without allowing it to define us. His relationship with his new partner blossomed naturally. It wasn't made of grand events or theatrical displays. It was made of presence. Of details. Of a kind of love that is built in silence, unhurriedly, without open scars, but with respect for each healed pain. One Sunday afternoon, during a quiet walk through a park far from the city center, she looked at him tenderly and asked, "Do you still think about her?" He took a few seconds, then answered honestly, "I do." Not as someone who misses her, but as someone who remembers a place where they were happy and was also destroyed. "But now I'm where I should be." She smiled in response, as if she understood that maturity also means accepting that love comes after pain, and that no one arrives whole without having rebuilt themselves. Despite having definitively closed the chapter with his ex-wife, he couldn't help but occasionally recall the past with a certain analytical detachment. It wasn't nostalgia. It was a strange, human curiosity about how far she had gone with that regret. But he never sought to find out. He avoided crossing paths, avoided places where he knew he might find her, avoided nurturing anything that might reopen what was already scarred. However, the universe, as it always does, found a way for their paths to cross one last time, and this time, unexpectedly and inevitably. He'd been invited to give a lecture at a local university, to talk about emotional reconstruction and the role of writing in the healing process. At the end of the event, when the floor was open for questions from the audience, she was there. Not sitting, not hidden, but standing silently among the last in line, waiting her turn. The look in her eyes wasn't the same as the last time they'd spoken. There was weariness, but there was also something new, understanding. When she approached, she didn't ask questions, didn't beg for anything. She just looked at him and said, "It took all of this to finally understand who I was, and who you've always been." He nodded, with a slight movement of his head, and before she walked away, he said something he hadn't said before, not even to himself: "You didn't lose by betraying me. You lost because you didn't see the value before you destroyed it." She smiled sadly, with the kind of smile that comes from someone who understood too late the gravity of their own decisions, and then simply replied, "Yes. And now I have to learn to live with it." After that, she walked away without looking back. There was nothing more to be said. And they both knew it. On the way home, he didn't think about her. He thought about himself. That old version of himself, who for so long tried to save a relationship while losing himself within it. He thought about how much he'd changed. How much he'd learned. He thought about the woman waiting for him at home, reading a random book, barefoot on the sofa and a mug of tea in her hands. He thought about the kind of life he now led. And he felt proud for having chosen to follow it. For having decided he deserved more than fragmented love. That he deserved a whole bond. With reciprocity. With truth. She, in turn, returned home that day with a different kind of sadness. It was no longer guilt. It was acceptance. For the first time, she could see herself as she truly was in that relationship, someone who had everything and chose to throw it away. And understanding this wasn't liberating. It was cruel. Not because she expected reconciliation, that was no longer part of her desires, but because she now knew she would never again find someone who had loved her that way. And worse, she now knew that if she ever did, she would know how to acknowledge it, but perhaps she was no longer worthy of receiving it. That night, she sat down before a blank sheet of paper and, for the first time, wrote to herself. She wrote about the kind of woman she was, about how she allowed her ego to override her conscience, about how she confused neediness with freedom, vanity with entitlement, desire with connection. She wrote about mistakes without trying to justify them, without embellishing, without softening. And in the end, she signed with her own name, as if accepting her story without trying to rewrite it with excuses. Then she closed the notebook and put it away in a box. Not to forget, but to never make the same mistakes again. Because there, in that moment, she understood that not all pain teaches. Some only alert us to how much hurt we are capable of. Meanwhile, across town, he walked into his house and found his partner sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by old childhood photo albums. Seeing him, she smiled, held out her hand, and said, "Sit here, I want to show you a part of my story." He sat down, picked up one of the photos, and listened attentively to each of her stories. And as she spoke, he thought about how good it felt to be there. To be part of a new story. One that wasn't created to fill gaps, but to create new memories. A story where no one needed to prove themselves, because everything was lived in person. He was exactly where he wanted to be. And the past, finally, was in its right place, behind him. It was the beginning of the final curve of that journey. A curve where there would be no more unexpected encounters, no more apologies, no more misplaced hopes. It was the path each would follow with what they chose, with what they lost, and with what they courageously rebuilt. Because, in the end, every love story ends somehow. But true love stories, even those that end, leave marks impossible to erase. And some, like theirs, even if they don't survive the test of time, teach lessons that time never erases. Time moved on, as it always does, indifferent to the weight it leaves on the shoulders of those left behind. And life, which never stops to wait for anyone, took care of putting everyone in their rightful place. He moved on, but not as one running from the past. He moved on with the tranquility of someone who has faced their own ghosts, carried the pain they needed to carry, cried all they had to cry, and, in the end, chose to live. There was no more anger, no desire for revenge, no hidden resentment. There was peace. The silent peace of someone who has endured chaos and found meaning in rebuilding. He married again, this time without grand ceremony, but with a firm gaze upon the woman who now shared his routine, his space, and his days. The vows exchanged between them were simple, almost whispered, but charged with truth. There, before a few witnesses, he sealed not only a new union, but a pact with himself, to never again accept less than he deserved. The new relationship grew strong because it was nourished with maturity. It wasn't built on unrealistic expectations, nor on desperate attempts to prove love. It was built on dialogue, listening, and freedom. He found in his new partner a different mirror than the one in the past, a reflection that didn't distort, that didn't demand perfection, but that saw him whole, with all his flaws and qualities, and loved him precisely for that. With her, he discovered the lightness of not having to fight every day to be noticed. Their happiness was daily, without great climaxes, but solid. And in this new chapter, he rebuilt even the dreams he had buried, he returned to writing frequently, published a book that touched the hearts of thousands, and began speaking about overcoming obstacles, self-love, and new beginnings. He became an inspiration, not because he lived a fairy tale, but because he survived what seemed unbearable and chose not to become bitter. As the years passed, she continued to live in an increasingly small world. Opportunities began to seem distant. Relationships became superficial. Not for lack of trying, but because there was an absence within her that was impossible to hide. She had become someone who carries in her eyes the burden of knowing she had destroyed what was most valuable. She tried other stories, but none went far. There was always something that prevented the bond from deepening. It was the distrust of others or, often, her own fear of repeating her own mistakes. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't give herself in the same way. And over time, she realized that love, when true and lost by choice, exacts its price in the form of emptiness. A kind of absence that no other presence can fill. She began to live a more introspective life, away from the hustle and bustle, seeking to fill the silence with new projects, courses, and short trips. But wherever she sought solace, she inevitably stumbled upon memories. The past found her in smells, in voices, in songs played by chance on cafe radios. And each memory came as a cruel reminder, you can't undo what's been done, nor revive what's been abandoned. One day, years after everything, she received an invitation in the mail to the launch of a new book of his. It wasn't a provocation. It was something that had been sent en masse to old contacts from the time when they ran in the same circles. She hesitated to open it. But when she read the title on the cover, When Love is the End and the New Beginning, she knew that, somehow, that book spoke to her. She didn't have the courage to go to the event. She bought the book days later, in an empty bookstore, and read it alone, from beginning to end, with tears that didn't interrupt her reading, but accompanied every page. The book didn't mention names, but it told in detail the story of someone who loved, lost, and had to rebuild amidst the rubble of what was left. And at the end, there was a simple dedication, to those who had everything, but didn't know how to take care of themselves. May they find, one day, peace. She understood. There was nothing left to be done. No chance. No door left ajar. It was the end. Not the dramatic kind that ends in screams and promises of reconciliation, but the quieter, more painful end, the one where the other no longer feels anything. Where the love was whole, and for that very reason, it couldn't continue after the breakup. And she, who once had everything, ended up with the memory of what she lost. With the knowledge of what she had done. And with the weight of knowing she would never again experience such pure love. Time passed, as it always does. But it left different marks on each of us. He moved on with new projects, new dreams, new bonds. Life became lighter again, and the traumas became lessons learned. When he looked back, there was no hatred, only compassion. Because loving someone who chose to hurt you is one of the most painful experiences you can go through. But surviving it is one of the most liberating. He didn't forget. He simply overcame it. He transformed what he experienced into a story, the story into words, and the words into healing, not only for himself, but for those who listened to him. She, in turn, continued walking with measured steps. She carried on with her days as if serving a sentence imposed by no one but herself. There was no resentment in what I felt. Only pain. A discreet, resigned pain. The pain of someone who understood that love, when left untended, doesn't transform, it dies. And that losing it isn't a punishment, it's the natural consequence of turning one's back on what many spend their entire lives seeking. And so this story ends. A story where there were no happy endings for everyone, but there was emotional justice. An ending where true love was honored, not with reconciliation, but with growth. A story that shows, with rawness and beauty, that betrayals don't just kill relationships, they destroy trust, dreams, what could have been. And that, once broken, not all love returns. Because love also gets tired. It also gives up. And sometimes, no matter how much it hurts, moving on is the only dignified path for those who were faithful to the end. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments, what did you think of this story? What touched you most? Do you think she deserved forgiveness or that he did the right thing by moving on? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this, with memorable, emotional endings that make us reflect on the choices we make. And remember, on this channel, no type of betrayal is supported or justified. The stories told here are fiction, but they reflect profound truths. Betrayal doesn't just destroy marriages. It destroys homes, dreams, futures. And worse, it destroys the essence of love, trust. Because there is no greater pain than being betrayed by someone who promised to be your refuge. May this story serve as a warning, a reflection, and an inspiration for those who still believe in love, but above all, in respect. See you next time.